it's worse than that, Congressman Dan Goldman. I mean, people that were left just reading the report, I did on the air, and I had the investigative reporting from the New York Times on the table and was able to fact-check some of what came out. And that is what is projected onto the facts, and the reality of the Durham report is spin, left-wing spin. I mean, we are so far down the rabbit hole that to just sort of stand at sea level and say Durham found nothing new, his 2 prosecutions failed, and the projections and hopes and dreams that Trump and his allies had were an absolute dud and a flop, is actually viewed as a partisan statement, when this is what is actually the hyperbole, the spin, and the disinformation. Let me show you Fox's reaction.
Yeah, it is outrageous that this happened. And it is arguably worse than Watergate when you look at all the facts.
It is astonishing to me. It is outrageous that here we are 7 years later after they stole 4 years of a presidency, and they tried to undermine and overthrow democracy. There has been zero reform, zero accountability, zero consequence for the people who attempted this coup.
What they need to do is this. They need to appoint a loyalist as FBI director. Kind of the way that JFK appointed his brother to run the Justice Department. You either need a loyalist or you need some guy that you have so much dirt on that he wouldn't even try anything.
We're now so far around the circle that they're advocating for corruption. And for the record, Christopher Wray was Chris Christie's former defense attorney, private defense attorney, who was handpicked by Donald Trump. Now that he hasn't been loyal to Donald Trump, I suppose, is the indictment. But he is Donald Trump's handpicked FBI director.
Yeah, it's the Republicans and the far right are completely spinning off the planet, but this is much worse than just simply he didn't find anything. The reporting that Charlie and others did 6 months ago or so, excuse me, really demonstrated that John Durham had morphed from a prosecutor into a political animal. You don't get prosecutors who resign very frequently, especially not outside of the Trump administration. That is really unusual, especially his number 2. You don't get a special counsel going and trying to change an inspector general's report. And ultimately, what he found is not only that there was nothing there, but it actually justified what the FBI did, even though he completely misconstrued the facts on the ground. Now, he said that this is a preliminary investigation, would have been legitimate to start Operation Crossfire Hurricane. Let's remember how this started. This didn't start in April of 2016 when the Australian diplomat heard from George Papadopoulos that Russia had emails and they were going to drop them. It started after Russia did it. And then all of a sudden the Australian diplomat was like, wait a minute, the Trump campaign had advance notice of that. I got information that this relates to Russia. The corroboration that John Durham says doesn't exist in the investigative files and the intelligence files existed in plain sight, and yet he doesn't talk about that. That is a complete abdication of his responsibility. The other thing is he goes on and on and on about the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier had nothing to do with the origination of the investigation, and it had nothing to do with the Mueller report or the numerous prosecutions and convictions brought by Special Counsel Mueller. So what this really is it is a political hatchet job by a political animal dressed up in a prosecutor's clothes, and that is the most dangerous of all because he has a veneer of apoliticism, even though he is clearly a political animal. And even with that, the Republicans are off the reservation. Nothing that they're saying is included in his report. So this is disinformation beyond disinformation. Even Republican Ben Klein said today that this was proof that the FBI interfered in the election in support of Hillary Clinton and against Donald Trump in 2016. How can that happen if it never went public? Nothing public ever came out about that investigation. So how could it actually interfere? This is really, really scary stuff coming from the right wing.
Well, and Dan Goldman, Congressman Goldman, I want to ask you, with Trump as a candidate for office in 2024, you know, the investigation isn't opened into Trump initially. It turns into an investigation also looking at Trump after he fires Comey, and the obstruction of the investigation. Question is on the table whether or not doing the work that would make Vladimir Putin happy is also part of a national security question. I mean, Trump very prominently last week towed Vladimir Putin's line as someone largely seen to be a war criminal. I mean, he's a candidate for office in 2024 who still has a direct call and answer between Vladimir Putin. What happens to those questions when you have one of the country's two political parties in government and out immune or unable to look at any questions about Trump's affinity for Putin?
Right. I mean, let's remember, though, this didn't even originate as an investigation into Trump. It originated as a counterintelligence investigation into Russian efforts to interfere in the election. It morphed into an investigation, rather, of the Trump campaign because evidence materialized that people like Paul Manafort were giving internal campaign data to a Russian intelligence agent who he had worked with. So that is also a very important predicate to this entire conversation. But we've known of Donald Trump's favoritism toward Vladimir Putin since 2016 and thereafter. We've seen it in Helsinki in 2018 when he publicly chose to side with Vladimir Putin, who has openly expressed his antagonism toward the United States over our own intelligence community. This is very much baked in, and what I think we all need to be focused on and calling out, and that includes Charlie and the New York Times and other journalists, is we need to be aggressively calling out the misinformation and disinformation that is coming from the right wing and that will unquestionably come from Donald Trump over the next 18 months as he uses this Durham report as part of his campaign. It needs to be called out by independent journalists, objective journalists. Certainly we will be banging the drum on Capitol Hill, but this is something that needs to be really aggressively attacked.
I mean, I guess if you step back, Congressman, I mean, Manafort, Flynn, Stone, Gates, and Papadopoulos were all found guilty in the court of law. What is Durham saying? That they weren't really guilty of the crimes they confessed, pleaded to, or were convicted of?
I have no idea what confirmation bias he's talking about when you have either guilty pleas or jury verdicts convicting all of these people in connection with the Russia investigation, and yet you have acquittals essentially across the board in the piddly cases that John Durham brought. You want to talk about a waste of time and money. The John Durham investigation is an embarrassment, and it should go down as one of the biggest abuses of power and waste of money in the Department of Justice's history. But there's no confirmation bias here. Special Counsel Mueller did an investigation and convicted people. They pled guilty or they were convicted at trial. So, and he established, as did the Inspector General, that the initial investigation was open justifiably. Durham doesn't even really quibble with that. He says it should have been preliminary, not a full investigation, which is, for the majority of lay people outside of the Department of Justice, a distinction without a difference. And so it is a real abomination. And the fact that he wastes 300 pages on this, including so much about the Steele dossier, which the Inspector General had also addressed, just goes to show how political this is. And it's almost as if the Republicans had their talking points written before the report came out and they ever saw it. They were going to say the same things no matter what was in the report. And it's a real shame that we have to deal with this.